I can't think of another gaming franchise that has radically changed as much as the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. And because it seems like the series fundamentally changes the gameplay formula almost every other game, there's always debates and discourse about which game is better, and sometimes it changes every other week. You know, Sonic had a rough transition to 3D, yada yada yada. So Kotaku ranked every single 3D Sonic game, and apparently this list is absolutely wild. So let's react and review this list, but make sure to subscribe to the channel with all notifications. I'll give you a second. And let's see what they got. Coming in at number 16, they have Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric. Gonna be honest, there's probably no contest from me here. This game has a 32 on Metacritic and also has an equally poor user score, which is 3.7 out of 10. But yeah, no surprise here. So this is what they had to say. They said the Sonic Boom sub-franchise brought us a pretty good animated series, but the Wii U exclusive Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric remains one of the worst games in the series' long history. I'd have to agree with the fact that the animated series was actually pretty good, and the DS games weren't like horrible compared to the Wii U title. They said while it may not be memed to hell and back as the next game on the list, so they're obviously going to go with Sonic 06 at number 15, it deviates so drastically from the speed-driven platforming of the Sonic franchise that it loses a lot of the series' identity. Instead, it's pretty much a beat-em-up that occasionally lets Sonic and friends run fast. Its 2D segments feel more evocative of the classic Sonic games, but even these are built around momentum-killing puzzles between bursts of adrenaline. Even when Sonic games are at their worst, they're rarely this generic and devoid of why people like these games. At the very least, it has some of the Boom series' decent comedic writing, but that's all it can claim. Yeah, I would say that this game is definitely worse than Sonic 06, and people talk about the damage that 06 did to the franchise, but I think that this was a lot worse. For what it's worth, Sonic Boom actually lost Sega money, and it completely underperformed in terms of sales. At least 06 actually sold some copies, and that game was so bad that we had to go back to the most generic of the boost formula with Sonic Forces, just to like get Sonic back to where it claimed it used to be. So definitely a devastating blow for the franchise. Maybe it wasn't quite as impactful as 06 because the game is just so memed on to this day, but I definitely agree with this being the worst 3D Sonic game. Next on Kotaku's list at number 15 is Sonic 06, and obviously this is no surprise. Gaming journalists definitely hate this game, and honestly, rightfully so. To me, this game truly is Sonic Adventure 3, and it like when I was playing this game as a kid, I did enjoy this game, but obviously you have to understand that this is a poor product. It was rushed out, it was buggy, the developers of the game were crunched. This game should not have released when it did. They said that Sonic 06 is widely considered to be the worst game in the Sonic franchise, and for a good reason. It's buggy, has insufferably long load times that are placed even in the middle of levels, and that's the second most frustrating part, behind the camera being the all-time worst for the franchise. Sonic 06 feels so flimsy and imprecise in the character controls and level design that its use of multiple playable characters feels more like a gimmick than something the game is built around. Fans have even tried remaking Sonic 06 to help some of its better elements shine through, and absolutely it does, because despite being perhaps one of the most frustrating video games to play of all time, there's actually some redeeming qualities, absolutely. The writing specifically around Shadow the Hedgehog and his team is genuinely introspective, the soundtrack is full of bangers, and it was one of the last games in which the Sonic cast felt like fleshed out characters instead of flanderized caricatures of themselves. It's a prime example of the Sonic series having interesting, bold ideas, but executing them so poorly that it pushed out the developers to retreat back into the basics in future games. It's a shame because the series got a bit generic in the aftermath. I don't know this journalist's experience with the Sonic franchise, but they're pretty much spot on with their analysis of Sonic 06. I personally love the game. I grew up playing this game, so I have a lot of love for it, but you cannot deny the obvious flaws that exist within the game. And a lot of that is being the fact that the game itself is barely playable at times. And while we appreciate the stakes and ambition that the story has, there is some weird elements that I don't need to talk about. We all know what the weird elements of the story are and the weird elements that we absolutely hate and despise. But with that being said, the level design of the game is actually pretty good and is very in line with the openness of Sonic Adventure, with some of the later mechanics that the series introduced in SA2, like the bounce attack, the ranking system, and everything like that. Could have been the greatest Sonic game ever. If this game wasn't rushed and was actually polished, you take some of the weird stuff out, you get Project 06. And that definitely shows that this game could have been an absolute masterpiece. It's really a shame because this really felt like the next gen Sonic Adventure 3, but now we'll probably never get that. But let's move on to the next game. Next on the list is 14, Shadow the Hedgehog. And honestly, I think they're kind of on a roll with this list. I mean, I don't really see too much wrong with it yet. So here's their take on Edgy the Hedgy spinoff. It says, speaking of a Sonic game with a lot of poorly executed ideas, Shadow the Hedgehog is another broadly loathed entry in the gaming lexicon. Again, for good reason. But at least it doesn't have Sonic 06's load times. Instead, we get an extremely busy, unfocused creation that has glimpses of a decent Sonic game sprinkled throughout. When Shadow's getting to run through levels uninterrupted, blazing through environments and being his speedy self, Shadow the Hedgehog feels about as good as any other 3D Sonic game of that era. It also weighs down all that speed with unnecessary amateurish action game bloat. Shadow gets firearms in this game and he can't properly aim. He can ride in vehicles that are slower than he is on foot. Instead of running through levels, he ends up completing obtuse objectives and time-consuming collectathons in order to reach alternative routes and story branches. Yeah, Shadow the Hedgehog has alternate endings, but none of them are canon and basically what-if scenarios where you learn more about his past. Oh, also, he swears from time to time. Shadow the Hedgehog has ideas. A game that lets you reach multiple conclusions and interpret a character's past in different ways is pretty neat, even by modern standards. It's just handled so poorly that it is impossible to unearth the gems in this mountain of The theme song, I Am All of Me, is still an all-time banger, though. Yeah, I would say that this game is not great. I mean, it has definitely redeeming qualities to it. It's basically Sonic Heroes, but you play as one character in terms of, like, how the game plays. There's some decent platforming. The controls are still as slippery as Sonic Heroes. If you do a neutral playthrough of the game where you just get from start to finish for the levels, it is not that bad. I mean, they're definitely right about that. The story mission objectives are extremely bad, though. I mean, they literally take Sonic, which is a speed-based platformer, and just slow it down to do tedious objectives, which are sometimes, like, very hard to complete in your first go around of the level. So you'll complete the level and then you got to run through it all over again, looking in every single corner to find that one little robot that you missed. I personally love the game growing up, and I do like to judge games based off of how they are at their best. And you know, at its best, it's like mid, but the fact that you have to complete 10 different campaigns and a lot of them require you to do the tedious objectives just makes the game really bad to play. So I agree with this game being ranked pretty low. At number 13 on the list, they put Sonic Lost World, and what they said about this game is that it was the last step on the retreat to safety the series took after Sonic 06. It keeps a lot of the basics for the Sonic franchise in terms of tone, aesthetics, and level design, but it's so basic in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't quite stick out, even amongst the rest of Sonic's 3D adventures. It does, however, have some really cool Nintendo crossover levels as part of it being a Wii U exclusive at launch, and they don't really say much else about the game, but I will say that this is one of my least favorite 3D Sonic games. You want to like it, right? Like, you look at the game, it looks like a classic Sonic game. It's got some charm, it's got some vibes. The game isn't buggy. It's quite polished, actually. Like, think of that, a 3D Sonic game that's not like a total janky mess. But to me, the game never really felt that quite good to play. I really do not enjoy the physics in this game. I don't like the story of this game. I don't like the way Sonic feels in this game. It feels like knockoff Super Mario Galaxy as opposed to a Sonic the Hedgehog game. The homing attack is weird. It doesn't really feel like there's true momentum in the game. Like, just everything about it to me is just off, and I don't really have fun playing this game. The boss battles are tedious. There's some good ideas, but the game wasn't received well, so Sonic Team scrapped the concepts that were pretty good and decided to move on. And since Sonic Team moved on, we are also moving on to the next game on the list. The next game they have on the list is Sonic and the Black Knight. They said the storybook sub-series, a Wii U exclusive fantasy duology, has always been a little silly, and seeing Sonic wield a sword in Sonic and the Black Knight is no exception. They said while mainline Sonic games were entering an identity crisis at this time, Black Knight and its predecessor, Secret Rings, were at least still experimenting with the spiky blue ball. For Black Knight, Sonic is summoned by the granddaughter of the great wizard Merlin into the fantasy realm, where he not only runs fast, but gets in sword fights and has fantasy versions of his friends and rivals. It's a fun scenario, but the entire thing is hampered by its unresponsive and imprecise controls. After two of these games with middling to bad reception, perhaps it was a good thing the series hasn't returned. And yeah, as much as I love the characterization of Sonic and the story of this game and the voice acting, like, this was clearly the best Sonic we've ever seen, it's still one of those like auto-scrolling games with like janky motion controls. As a Sonic game, as the core gameplay of Sonic is, which is like a speed-based platformer, it's not like the best game to play, and it's not really in line with what the series is about, but it's a spin-off that experimented, and I'd like to see them try stuff like this again and at least write Sonic and voice act him like they did in this game. All that being said, I don't have a problem with this game being ranked pretty low, because they use the same philosophy to rank Sonic and the Secret Rings at number 11. Believe it or not, Sonic and the Secret Rings has a 69 on Metacritic, which actually isn't like a terrible score. It's only 2 points off of Sonic Frontiers. The fan base definitely thought Black Knight was better because it got a higher user score by 2 points, but also Black Knight has a 54 critic score on Metacritic. It really depends on what you like better. Do you like swinging the Wii remote and good storytelling? Or do you want another motion control endless runner Sonic game? Pick your poison between the two. Let's move on to the next game. Next up, they put Sonic 3D Blast, which is it even a 3D game? They put it at number 10. They said Sonic's first 3D outing looks very different when compared to its modern counterparts. Sonic 3D Blast isn't quite the fast-paced roller coaster that has become synonymous with the franchise, instead using an isometric perspective for a more collectathon platformer. Looking back, it definitely feels like Sega was still testing the waters with a 3D space and hadn't quite figured out what a 3D Sonic would be. What it lacks in breakneck speed and thrills, it makes up for with its simplistic charm. I think this game I hate probably more than almost any other game on the list. Maybe we'll put it just above Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric, but to me, Sonic 3D Blast is just not fun. You want it to be fun, like it's got a charming aesthetic to it, and I'm sure when this game came out, it was decent for the time, but the platforming is horrible in the game with the isometric camera view. It's hard to like immerse into those type of games also. It's not actually 3D, it's like fake 3D, and it's just flat out boring. Collectathons are not usually good for high-speed platformers unless the collecting is built into the high-speed platforming. This is just like clunky, boring, and after the first level, I find it hard to continue playing. I would actually put this below Lost World. I put it below the storybook games, but I can see why someone like Kotaku would say this game is okay. For what it's worth, the game has a very cohesive gameplay philosophy. It doesn't really deviate from its formula or experiment with anything. It's pretty straightforward, whereas the other games kind of vary in quality throughout. I can't really find anything redeeming about this game, but if you like the formula of the game, it doesn't really deviate at all throughout, so you'll probably enjoy it, and maybe that's why they did, but I do not. Next up, they put Sonic Forces at number 9. They said that Sonic Forces feels like a game that's almost out of its time. Its self-serious story about Sonic and friends going to actual war with Dr. Eggman feels something out of the series' early 2000s phase when it was trying to go for more mature storylines. However, it lacks the same gravitas that has made games like Sonic Adventure 2 more beloved. What's here is a crowded ensemble cast with little to do, which is, I mean, I definitely agree with that, beyond giving Sega a chance to play with all of its toys. There's a lot of characters in this game, but only 3 of them are playable, and 2 of them are basically Sonic, so that leaves us with 2, and then one's just like an uninteresting avatar editor. I don't like OCs, I never did. The story does give Forces a unique element that still stands the test of time, the player avatar. After years of making OCs, Forces lets players create their own character to take part in Sonic's resistance, and they said its creation options weren't too expansive, but it was a really cool thing for Sega to put into a game after creating original characters that have become so ingrained into the Sonic community. So that's all they really had to say about Forces, and I kind of agree, you know, it's in the middle of the pack. That means it's mid. I think Forces is a very mediocre game. There's a lot of issues with it, right? It's like the most watered down version of the boost formula. Some of the levels are so easy you can complete them with one hand, and the boosting stages for Sonic only last like a minute sometimes. The writing in the game is pretty bad. We know the issues with this game, but I don't think it's the worst Sonic game ever. There's some games on this list that I think are worse to play. I actually think Lost World is worse than Forces for what it's worth. It's not a good game, but it's not the worst game. So I actually agree with them putting it at around number 9 in the middle of the pack. There's a lot of angles that we can criticize this game at, but I think if I had to sum it up with one piece of criticism, I think the biggest crime that this game has is that it's extremely underwhelming and disappointing considering the hype that the game had in its pre-release. So that's the biggest offense the game has in my opinion. But let's move on to the next game because it's going to start to get pretty crazy. Here's where I think the controversy starts. So they have Sonic Unleashed at number 8 on the list. This is the aftermath of Sonic 06 and Sonic transitioning into a new gameplay style with the boost formula in the 3D games, and you'll notice that it had a 60 on Metacritic, which is pretty mediocre by critic standards, 6 out of 10. This is one of those weird games because it kind of had this like revisionist history or like this turnaround within the Sonic fan base. While the game was poorly received by critics, over time a lot of fans realized that this game was kind of a hidden gem. It introduced the boost formula into 3D. While yes, it was in Sonic Rush previously, but this was the first time it was actually brought into the mainline 3D titles. And the boost formula was extremely well received. Everyone liked the daytime levels in Sonic Unleashed, and in my opinion, Sonic Unleashed probably has the best boosting levels in the entire franchise, considering it's more based off of reaction-based platforming, especially when you consider the 2D sections. And also the game just looks really good too, and it has a charming story. The biggest drawback for many was the Werehog, which was the slow beat-em-up God of War style button mashy combat, some of the levels being extremely long. So that's why people didn't like the game, and personally I don't love the Werehog, but the game in and of itself feels like a Pixar Disney movie. It feels AAA in quality. It's truly a special game. So this is what Kotaku has to say about it. They said Unleash exists in a weird window immediately following the backlash to 06, trying to return to basics but not quite shaking off some of the experimental aspects of Sonic's aughts era. Yet it trims down to only having Sonic as a playable character, and its speed-based levels are some of the best of the era. Yes, true. I said the same exact thing. The gimmick of the game is that during the night, Sonic turns into a Werehog. Yes, that means a werewolf hedgehog. When Sonic undergoes his transformation, the game shifts into a beat-em-up platformer, complete with more box moving, puzzle solving, climbing, and slapping enemies around instead of running past them. While it's not the most popular diversion from Sonic Speed, it's relatively restrained. Unleashed takes some swings, and while they don't all land, it was a decent recentering following some overcrowded games. As a big Unleashed fan, I say that this is definitely a controversial placement because there's still 7 more games to go, and I gotta say, out of all of these games, there's definitely some that Unleashed, in my opinion, are better than, but let's keep going. So next up, they have Sonic Frontiers at number 7. Now, I personally disagree with this because I like Sonic Frontiers a lot. I'm a big defender of the game. It has a lot of great concepts, a lot of great ideas, and I generally like the gameplay. I love the gameplay formula, and I feel like it's one of the most important 3D Sonic games to ever release, as it's one of the most successful 3D Sonic games to ever release. There's certainly some middling reception amongst the fan base, so it's not all perfect, and there's some issues with the game, but truly it's one of my favorite titles. So I actually think this should be higher, but I also do have it higher than Sonic Unleashed, believe it or not. They said that 2022's Frontiers is one of the most recent games on the list, and it takes the series in a different direction, drawing inspiration from Breath of the Wild. They also mentioned how Sega wants it to be the foundation for the future, and while it's not the most lived open world, Frontiers gives you a vast map to run around as the world's fastest hedgehog, and it's not a bad pitch for what's next. Some of the series' most frustrating moments come from feeling restricted when you just want to run wild, and Frontiers feels like letting your dog out in an open field, free to run to your heart's content. The puzzles you solve, the enemies you fight, and the collectibles you find are actually just extra. So yeah, Frontiers is actually higher on my personal list, but then putting it at number 7 out of 18, I mean, listen, for some of the criticism that's out there about the game, like the bad pop-in, the janky cyberspace controls, and the lack of polish, I'm not upset by this. But let's move on to the next one. Next up on the list at number 6, they put Sonic Colors. Sonic Colors is one of those games where if you log on Twitter, you'll find like a lot of haters of the game, but in my opinion, I think it's one of the more important games that the franchise has released because this was following like Sonic 06, Sonic and the Black Knight, Sonic and the Secret Ring, Sonic Unleashed. Like these were all games with like very bad reception, so the franchise was in a really bad spot. They just needed to get back to the basics and put out a good Sonic game. And to me, that's very much what Colors is. It's just a good Sonic game. It's the boost in gameplay everyone liked from Sonic Unleashed, but that's just the entire game. The only problem with it though, like my personal criticism of the game, is there's a lot of 2D in it. You know, a lot of people want a 3D Sonic game, not a 2D Sonic game. But ultimately, with the gimmicks that they add in the game, like the Wisps, the 2D sections actually aren't bad. There's a little double jump. The problem with the game also is just the story of it. Obviously, no one likes the cheesy, cartoony stories, but maybe that's what we needed at the time. Sure, it's a little childish, but ultimately, gameplay had to be the #1 focus because Sonic was failing in that department. They said when Sonic Colors launched in 2010, it was practically a complete rebrand for the franchise. The Wii exclusive fully moved away from the darker learnings of the adventure era. Sonic was once again the sole playable character without a werehog, and Sega even delisted old Sonic games that had lower Metacritic scores because they wanted it to be a fresh start. It was considered to be a return to form for a franchise that had lost its way, and beautifully merged 2D and 3D formats into a colorful, adrenaline-pumping platformer that got the heart of what fans wanted. The ensemble's cast absence was felt, and it only feels like the franchise is getting back to including characters who aren't Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles now, but Colors was a perfectly distilled version of what Sonic needed to be after years of not knowing what it meant to be a Sonic game. So it's not all that controversial to have it at number 6 or even have it over games like Frontiers and Unleashed. I don't have it over those games personally, but this game was received higher than both games. So you can see why some game journalists at Kotaku, whose main focus is in Sonic, might like this game more than those games. So not too controversial, but the top 5 is gonna get a little crazy. Coming in at number 5, they have Sonic Dream Team, and they said, like Colors, Dream Team is about distilling a Sonic game to its core loops. He's got to go fast, it's got to be simple to read where you need to go, and it has to control smoothly in the process. The Apple Arcade game is snappy, gorgeous to look at, and it is a really solid summation of what a Sonic game should feel like. It's a shame it's not on consoles because more people should be playing it. So this might be controversial for some of you. So they have a mobile game that a lot of people did not get to play, ranked over mainline titles like full-blown AAA titles like Sonic Unleashed, Sonic Colors, Sonic Frontiers. There's no doubt that the game is good, but I do feel like there's some neutering with the controls because it's developed for mobile. So there's like some things that are missing, like the stomp attack. I think the air controls could be a little bit better. Swapping between playable characters is kind of a chore to do in the game, but hey, I mean, listen, they're saying this is a top 5 3D Sonic game ever. That's a bold claim. Let me know if you guys agree with that down below, but let's move on to the next game. The next game that they put on the list is my personal #1, Sonic Adventure 1. We all know that this game is the GOAT because it has the infinite spin dash. What other Sonic game do you see a path like this where you could just skip right over it and learn new skips every single day in the game? And it's just the best to control. By far, this game, I would argue, probably even controls better than SA2 because you have the spin dash. But not only that, I feel like the collision, at least in this version, is like a little bit better. Like when I'm running on SA2, I feel like I'm about to fall off the map a lot. But anyways, I mean, I could go off about this for years. I should do a full retrospective on this game, but let's get into what Kotaku's saying. They said that the original Sonic Adventure in 1999 was a blueprint for the franchise for years. They said the transition to 3D had everything: multiple playable characters whose gameplay differentiated substantially from Sonic's, a storyline with emotional stakes, and some capital L lore. Pseudo open world elements that had Sonic and friends traveling through hub worlds to get to levels. And to interject and intervene about the hub worlds, I just gotta say, the first game I ever played growing up was Sonic Heroes, so it was like level to level transition for the story, kind of disjointed, right? And then you have Sonic Adventure 2, which has level to level transition a little bit disjointed, but it's all connected by the map in like the level select. And then I played Sonic Adventure, so I went backwards with these games. I played Sonic Adventure, and the immersion that I got from the hub world in the game was absolutely insane. Like, if you talk to some of the NPCs in the hub world, they'll literally tell you like what's going on with the story as it's progressing. Having 6 intertwining stories, and then like if you're running around as Sonic, you'll see Big the Cat and his portion of the story, and vice versa for Sonic. Like, it was just insane. And if you think about the levels in the game, it was truly an extension of the hub world. We're in Station Square right now, but if you go into Emerald Coast, you still see like the hotel over here. So it's like the level of immersion was just absolutely insane for the younger me. So that's why I feel like Sonic Adventure did the hub worlds the best. But anyways, let's continue. They said they had a banging soundtrack led by Crush 40, definitely. They said Sonic Adventure has stumbles such as Big the Cat's cumbersome fishing levels. Listen, Big the Cat's fishing levels are easy. You can beat his campaign in 15 minutes. This is a skill issue, all right? For some reason, I always found his campaign to be kind of like charming. It's like cozy simulator gameplay. They also said it set the standard for a wonky camera, which, okay, I guess is true. But they said it's a quintessential moment in the franchise's history, and even Sega has a newfound nostalgia for it, as evidenced by darker games like Sonic Forces and the lore-driven story of the Sonic the Hedgehog 2 movie. The interwoven character stories were a deviation from its platformer contemporaries, and as the series has narrowed its focus on just the blue guy, it's been missing that magic. Yes! That is absolutely true. They have it at number 4. I personally have it higher, but I'm not upset by Sonic Adventure being at number 4. Let's move on to the next game, which is none other than Sonic Generations, the game that's actually going to be getting remastered later this year, and probably for a good reason. They said that 2011 Sonic Generations is a greatest hits compilation made into a video game. They said it's Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, but for the blue blur. They said when Sega was still wrestling with what it meant to be a Sonic game, it felt apt to go back and revisit everything that got us to this point for the 20th anniversary. Generation marries the series' 2D past with its 3D present, and that is definitely true with this game. Remixing and revamping old levels from throughout the series' history, giving modern and classic fans the best of both worlds. It's a nostalgia trip, but it's one of the tightest platformers with Sonic on the cover. And that's just the thing about this game. Why do people love Sonic Generations so much? I think I mean, when you think about Sonic Generations, it's a game that kind of plays it safe in terms of what it tries to do. It's not overly ambitious, but the thing is, it's just an extremely competent Sonic game. It's polished, it looks good, it plays good, the level design in the game is really good. Like, you can't really criticize much about the game in terms of like the typical things you would criticize in a Sonic game, like it being a janky, buggy, rushed mess with a weird story or something like that. This game just like gets pretty much everything right. But back to their article, they said sometimes the best way to move forward is to look back, and Sonic Generations examines the old and the new to give the best and worst a second chance to shine along the way. The next game they have on the list, no surprise here, is Sonic Adventure 2. They said Sonic Adventure 2 is arguably the best story in the franchise, introducing Shadow the Hedgehog as a malevolent foil to Sonic's whimsy and structuring the game around shifting perspectives of its leads. The sequel brings back multiple playable characters with Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles facing off against Shadow, Dr. Eggman, and Rouge in distinct playstyles. Sonic and Shadow keep the fast-moving platformer side of the series alive, while the other rivals use mechs or hunt for treasure. Sonic Adventure 2 hits a sweet spot using its ensemble cast to give players variety without overwhelming the experience. Unless you hate treasure hunting and mech stages, of course. All of this works to make Sonic Adventure 2 one of the most memorable games in the series, albeit with some frustrating camera nonsense and finicky controls, but the best part is still the elaborate story full of twists and turns that elevated Sonic and Knuckles' new rivals to series mainstays. And it set a standard for Sonic Final Acts, absolutely. From the sound of it, this will be at the heart of the Sonic Movie 3, which premieres in December, and Sonic Adventure 2 is peak, but there's one game we have to give the crown to. And yeah, just to touch on everything about SA2, obviously it's like one of the best Sonic games ever. I think it's like 1A, 1B kind of thing. I like Adventure 1 better for the level design and the speed gameplay more, but obviously there's some good elements in SA2 that are better, like the bounce attack. You have like the trick system and stuff like that, the scoring system. So if you took the best of SA1, the best of SA2, you get Sonic P06, not Sonic 06. You know what I mean? But let's look at number 1, because this is controversial. Yes, they put Sonic Heroes at number 1 of all-time 3D Sonic games. They said coming off Adventure 2, Sonic Heroes is an underwhelming bummer in the story department, but it is, without a doubt, the most clever game in terms of integrating the series' ensemble cast into the way that you play. They said Heroes stars 4 teams of 3, each made up of a fast-running speedster, a powerful tank, and a flight-based hero. Heroes has you swap between the characters on the fly, making use of their unique talents to overcome obstacles, defeat Eggman's robot forces, and occasionally face upon one of the opposing teams if their interests collide. Heroes was foundational in defining who the Sonic cast would be for the next 20 years. It brought back favorites like Shadow and Rouge, as well as more obscure characters like Team Chaotix. Rather than having these characters be cameos in a crowded room, Heroes' team-based gameplay gives every character a chance to shine and manages to do so without bloating the game without too much nonsense or cumbersome modes. Unless you consider replaying the same game 4 times as bloat, so I would kind of disagree with that. I love Heroes. First of all, Heroes is my first Sonic game ever. I have high regard and esteem for that game, but number 1? That's crazy, but let's keep reading. They said, like most Sonic games of the era, Heroes hasn't aged perfectly, so how the hell is it number 1? And some of the imprecision and clunkiness can frustrate 20 years later. Yeah, so how the hell do you put this game over SA1 is what I want to know. But it's still the best example of a 3D Sonic game doing right by its cast and weaving their distinct abilities together into the level design. Over the years, the Sonic franchise has struggled to marry its huge, much beloved cast with the speed-centric expectations that come with Sega's Speed Demon. Heroes is the best example of everything clicking into place. Its story may be underwhelming after the adventure games, but a game all about the power of friendship and teamwork gives everyone equal spotlight can hit just as hard. So yeah, that's Kotaku's list. They have Sonic Heroes at number 1. They ranked 18 different 3D Sonic games. I love Sonic Heroes, but there's so many things that hold it back to making it like the number 1 game. It's a good game, but number 1 is crazy. The game definitely has a charming art style because it kind of goes back to like what the classic Sonic aesthetic is, but it brings it into the modern world. Also, if you like the gameplay style of Sonic Heroes, it doesn't change or deviate throughout. All 4 teams played the exact same way, so there's no like stupid fishing campaigns. It's just straight start to finish, get to point A to point B platforming like the original classic Sonic games. So I can see like if you really like Heroes, if you like playing as one team, you're gonna love the game. There's no split in terms of gameplay styles. It's all one style. So that's probably why if you really like Heroes, then you really like it. So I kind of see where they're coming from with that. Also, one thing I can really appreciate about Heroes is despite the fact that it's a much lighter story, the characters are all still written very well. Like they're all still written in character. Unlike a lot of the meta era games where the characters are just like goofy Saturday morning parodies of themselves, like the characters are still all cool in this game. They still have their own distinct and unique personalities without totally watering down their personalities. But let me know what you guys think about the list and drop your list. Rank all these games in the comments down below. I want to know what you guys have to say. Let's get all the discussion and discourse out there.